My name is Andrew Foster, and I'm a paleographer with 12 years of experience working at the University of Pennsylvania Center for Ancient Studies in Philadelphia. For over a decade, I've been deciphering some of the world's most challenging ancient texts, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Coptic manuscripts that most scholars won't even attempt to translate. My specialty is cross-referencing linguistic patterns between ancient civilizations, looking for connections that traditional archaeology might miss. 3 months ago, I was contacted by a private collector in New York who claimed to possess a cache of papyri that had been misplaced during the chaotic cataloging of artifacts from a 1920s excavation near Saqqara. What I discovered in those documents didn't just challenge everything I thought I knew about ancient Egypt. It revealed a hidden power structure that operated behind the pharaohs for over 2,000 years. And if you think you know where this is heading, trust me, you don't. Because what I found in those texts changed my understanding of how ancient civilizations were actually governed, and why certain knowledge was deliberately hidden from mainstream historical records. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell, a colleague from Columbia, had been contacted by an estate executor handling the belongings of recently deceased antiquities dealer Marcus Rothschild. Rothschild's collection included what appeared to be a set of hieratic papyri with unusual formatting, texts that seemed to blend Egyptian hieroglyphs with symbols that resembled Mesopotamian cuneiform. "Andrew, I've never seen anything like this," Rebecca told me over the phone. "The symbols are definitely Egyptian, but there are these recurring pictographs that look almost Sumerian, and the dating suggests they're from the New Kingdom period, around 1300 BCE. As someone who'd spent years studying the linguistic crossroads between ancient civilizations, this immediately caught my attention. Cross-cultural symbol systems in ancient Egypt were incredibly rare, especially from the New Kingdom when Egyptian culture was at its most insular and protective of its religious traditions. I drove to New York that weekend to examine the collection personally. Rothschild's estate was housed in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, filled with artifacts that would make any museum curator weep with envy. But it was the papyri that made my hands literally trembling as I carefully unrolled the first document. The text was written in late Egyptian hieratic script, but interspersed throughout were symbols I'd only seen in Mesopotamian texts, specifically symbols associated with the Anunnaki pantheon. More disturbing was the context in which these symbols appeared. They weren't references to foreign gods or diplomatic correspondence. They were integrated into Egyptian religious formulae, as if they belonged there naturally. The first document I translated was titled Instructions for the Hemnedger of the Hidden Council. Hemnedger was the standard Egyptian term for high priest, but I'd never encountered any reference to a hidden council in Egyptian religious literature. The text appeared to be a manual for a special class of priests who served what it called the Anunnaki Neteru, literally, the Anunnaki gods. My initial reaction was skepticism. Ancient forgeries weren't uncommon, and the combination of Egyptian and Mesopotamian elements could easily be the work of a modern forger trying to create something sensational. But as I examined the papyrus under magnification, everything about it screamed authenticity. The fiber patterns, the ink composition, even the way the scribe's hand had formed individual glyphs showed the subtle variations you'd expect from genuine ancient writing. I spent the next week at Rothschild's estate, photographing and cataloging the entire collection. There were 17 papyri in total, ranging from what appeared to be administrative records to detailed ritual instructions. But it was the 8th document that made my professional instinct scream that something was fundamentally wrong with everything I thought I understood about ancient Egyptian religion. The document was a genealogical chart, but not of human bloodlines. It traced the descent of Egyptian priestly families from what it called the first servants, beings who had arrived in Egypt during the pre-dynastic period and established the original religious hierarchy. According to this text, these first servants were direct descendants of the Anunnaki, and their human offspring had been running Egypt's temples for millennia. What made this particularly unsettling was how specific the document was about dates, names, and locations. It referenced real historical figures, actual temples, and events that I could verify through mainstream Egyptian records. But it presented them in a completely different context, not as purely human achievements, but as the result of guidance from a non-human intelligence that had been operating in Egypt since before the first dynasties. Have you ever had a moment where a single piece of information completely reshapes your understanding of something you thought you knew well? That's exactly what happened when I began cross-referencing these Egyptian texts with Mesopotamian sources I'd studied years earlier. I started by looking up the Mesopotamian references mentioned in the Egyptian texts. The Anunnaki, according to mainstream scholarship, were indeed a group of deities in ancient Mesopotamian religion, offspring of the sky god En and the earth goddess Ki. But what I found in the Egyptian documents suggested something far more concrete than mythological metaphor. The Egyptian texts described the Anunnaki not as distant gods, but as physical beings who had established permanent settlements in both Mesopotamia and Egypt during the 4th millennium BCE. According to these documents, they had divided the ancient Near East into administrative regions, with different Anunnaki taking responsibility for different areas of human development. The most detailed document, which I came to call the Saqqara Codex, contained what appeared to be a historical account of how the Anunnaki had established their Egyptian operations. It described how beings called the Sky Lords had arrived in Egypt around 3500 BCE and established what they called god houses, permanent installations that served as both temples and administrative centers. But here's where things got really interesting. The Codex claimed that these god houses weren't just religious sites. They were training facilities where selected humans were taught advanced knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and what the text called the manipulation of natural forces. The humans who completed this training became the first priests, and their descendants formed the hereditary priestly class that would control Egyptian religion for the next 3,000 years. The more I studied these documents, the more I realized that they provided a completely different explanation for some of Egypt's most puzzling historical mysteries. Why did Egyptian civilization appear so suddenly and fully formed around 3000 BCE? According to these texts, it was because they had help, systematic training, and guidance from beings with access to advanced knowledge. Why were Egyptian priests so incredibly powerful, sometimes rivaling or even surpassing the pharaohs in terms of real political control? Because they weren't just religious figures, they were the local representatives of a non-human administrative system that had been governing the region for millennia. I decided to test the claims in these documents by looking for corroborating evidence in mainstream Egyptological sources. What I found was fascinating and deeply unsettling. The timeline presented in the Egyptian texts aligned perfectly with what archaeologists call the rapid development period of Egyptian civilization. Between 3500 and 3000 BCE, Egypt transformed from a collection of primitive agricultural communities into the world's most sophisticated civilization almost overnight. Traditional archaeology attributes this to natural cultural evolution, but has never adequately explained how such rapid advancement was possible. The locations mentioned in the texts corresponded to sites that modern archaeology has identified as the earliest and most important religious centers in Egypt. Heliopolis, Memphis, Thebes, all of them were described in the Codex as original Anunnaki installations that later became the power centers of Egyptian priest kings. Most significantly, the texts provided detailed information about priestly practices that weren't supposed to be documented anywhere. Ancient Egyptian religious rituals were closely guarded secrets, passed down orally within priestly families. Yet these documents contained step-by-step instructions for ceremonies that mainstream Egyptology has only been able to reconstruct through fragments and guesswork. But it was when I started looking at the mathematics and astronomy in these texts that my excitement began mixing with genuine concern about what I'd uncovered. The Saqqara Codex contained astronomical calculations that were supposed to be impossible for ancient civilizations to make. The text included precise measurements of the Earth's circumference, accurate calculations of planetary orbital periods, and detailed star charts that matched modern astronomical observations with disturbing accuracy. For example, one section described the orbital period of what it called the returner, a celestial body that followed a 3,600-year cycle through the solar system. The mathematical precision of this calculation was extraordinary, but what made it truly unsettling was realizing that this matched exactly with modern astronomical theories about long-period comets and their gravitational effects on planetary systems. The text also included what appeared to be genetic information descriptions of biological processes that shouldn't have been understood until the development of modern molecular biology. One particularly detailed section described what are called the blending, a process by which the Anunnaki had modified early human genetics to create a population better suited for the great work. When I showed these calculations to Dr. Sarah Chun, a colleague in Penn's astrophysics department, her reaction was immediate and alarmed. "Andrew," she said after studying the documents for several hours, "some of these astronomical calculations weren't confirmed by modern science until the 1990s. How could ancient Egyptians have known about gravitational interactions between distant planets?" That question led me to dig deeper into the historical record, looking for evidence of the kind of advanced knowledge these texts claimed the priestly class possessed. What I found was a pattern of technological and intellectual achievements that seemed to appear in Egypt without any clear developmental process. Egyptian mathematics, medicine, and engineering appeared fully formed at the beginning of the dynastic period, without the gradual development you'd expect from normal cultural evolution. The construction techniques used in the pyramids involved engineering principles that weren't officially discovered until modern times. Egyptian medical papyri described surgical procedures and pharmaceutical knowledge that rivals modern medicine in its sophistication. Traditional Egyptology explains these achievements as the result of exceptional human genius and centuries of accumulated knowledge. But the documents I had found suggested a different explanation: systematic training by beings with access to advanced scientific understanding. I spent weeks trying to rationalize what I was reading, looking for conventional explanations that could account for the information in these texts. But the more I researched, the more I realized that the standard historical narrative had significant gaps that these documents filled perfectly. Have you ever noticed how many ancient Egyptian monuments seem to be oriented toward specific astronomical phenomena? According to these texts, that wasn't accidental. It was part of a systematic program of astronomical observation and recording that had been established by the Anunnaki and maintained by their priestly representatives for thousands of years. This is where things get really interesting from a cultural perspective. As I was researching these connections, I couldn't help but notice how many modern interpretations of ancient history, from Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods to the History Channel's Ancient Aliens, had been pointing toward the same conclusions I was reaching through academic research. For decades, popular culture has been suggesting that ancient civilizations received help from advanced non-human intelligences. These ideas have generally been dismissed by mainstream academia as pseudoscience and fantasy. But the documents I was studying provided what appeared to be historical evidence, supporting at least some of these theories. The timing was particularly striking. Von Daniken published his theories about ancient astronauts in 1968, the same year humanity first traveled to the moon. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens series began in 2010, just as digital technology was making it possible to analyze ancient texts and artifacts with unprecedented precision. It was as if popular culture had been preparing us for discoveries that serious archaeology was only now beginning to make. What made this even more intriguing was realizing that the entertainment industry seemed to understand aspects of ancient history that academic sources had overlooked. Movies like Stargate and Prometheus depicted scenarios remarkably similar to what I was reading in these Egyptian texts: advanced beings establishing civilizations, leaving behind technological knowledge, and maintaining contact through hereditary groups of human intermediaries. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if what we call science fiction might actually be a form of cultural memory, humanity's collective unconscious preserving information about our real origins and development. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about what happened when I tried to share these discoveries with my academic colleagues. My first presentation was at the University of Pennsylvania's monthly archaeology seminar in January. I'd prepared what I thought was a careful, scholarly analysis of the documents, focusing on their linguistic and historical significance rather than their more controversial implications. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the Egyptian Studies Department accused me of promoting dangerous pseudo-archaeology. Professor James Mitchell suggested that I'd been taken in by sophisticated modern forgeries. Several colleagues questioned whether I should continue my research into what they called fringe theories. But here's what bothered me most about their reactions. None of them were willing to examine the actual documents. They rejected my findings based on their implications rather than their evidence. When I offered to provide detailed photographs and chemical analysis results proving the authenticity of the papyri, most of them declined to look. This response made me realize something unsettling about how academic knowledge is controlled and distributed. There seems to be an unofficial consensus about what kinds of discoveries are acceptable and what kinds threaten established narratives. Evidence that supports conventional theories is welcomed and celebrated. Evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions is dismissed, regardless of its quality or authenticity. I started to understand why these documents might have been misplaced during their original excavation in the 1920s. Archaeological expeditions from that era were often funded by museums and universities with strong investments in particular historical narratives. Discoveries that didn't fit those narratives had a way of disappearing into private collections or being dismissed as anomalous. The more I researched the historical context of these discoveries, the more I realized that suppression of inconvenient archaeological evidence isn't just a conspiracy theory. It's a documented historical pattern. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeological discoveries that challenged religious or political orthodoxies were routinely minimized, misinterpreted, or hidden away. The Smithsonian Institution's alleged destruction of giant human skeletons found throughout North America, the Vatican's restriction of access to archaeological sites in the Holy Land, the Egyptian government's limitations on excavation and research at certain sites. There's a consistent pattern of institutional control over archaeological information that serves specific political and religious agendas. What made my situation particularly frustrating was realizing that the knowledge in these documents could revolutionize our understanding of human development, ancient technology, and our relationship with the cosmos. The medical information alone could advance modern healthcare by decades. The astronomical calculations could enhance our understanding of solar system dynamics. The engineering principles could solve contemporary construction challenges. But because this knowledge comes from sources that challenge conventional historical narratives, it's being systematically ignored by the very institutions that should be most interested in advancing human understanding. 3 weeks after my presentation at Penn, I received an unexpected email from Dr. Rebecca Hartwell. The Rothschild estate had been contacted by representatives claiming to represent the legitimate heirs of the papyri collection. Legal proceedings were being initiated to reclaim the documents before they could be studied further. When I tried to contact the estate's executor, I was told that the entire collection had been temporarily relocated, pending resolution of the ownership dispute. My requests for continued access were denied, and my photographs of the documents were deemed potentially infringing on proprietary rights. Within 6 weeks, the most significant archaeological discovery of my career had effectively disappeared. The documents were gone, my research was dismissed by my academic peers, and I was left with nothing but digital photographs that could easily be dismissed as elaborate hoaxes. But here's what they couldn't take away: the knowledge I gained about how ancient civilizations actually developed and why certain information has been systematically hidden from public understanding. The implications of what I discovered extend far beyond ancient history. If the Anunnaki were real beings who established civilizations throughout the ancient Near East, then human development has been guided by non-human intelligence for thousands of years. If the priestly classes of ancient civilizations were trained by these beings and maintained contact with them across generations, then there may be hereditary groups today who possess knowledge and capabilities that the rest of humanity doesn't understand. Think about it. How many times have you noticed that major technological breakthroughs seem to appear simultaneously in different parts of the world, as if the knowledge is being distributed from a central source? How many times have you wondered why certain ancient sites demonstrate engineering capabilities that we can barely match with modern technology? What if the rapid advancement of human civilization over the past few centuries isn't just the result of natural intellectual development? What if it's part of a systematic program of guided evolution that's been operating for millennia? I realize how all of this sounds. 3 months ago, I would have dismissed these ideas as fantasy, but the evidence I've seen suggests that our understanding of human history and development is fundamentally incomplete. There are forces and intelligences that have been operating behind the scenes of human civilization, and their influence continues today. The question isn't whether this information challenges conventional beliefs. It obviously does. The question is whether we're willing to examine evidence that might expand our understanding of who we are and where we came from, even if it means acknowledging that we're not alone and never have been. Since my access to the original documents was terminated, I've been working to verify the information they contain through other sources. What I've found is that fragments of this same knowledge appear in archaeological sites, historical documents, and cultural traditions throughout the ancient world. The Mesopotamian creation myths describe the Anunnaki as beings who came from the sky and established civilization. Ancient Indian texts describe the Vimanas, flying vehicles used by gods who taught humans advanced knowledge. Mayan codices reference sky beings who provided the knowledge necessary for their sophisticated astronomical calculations. These aren't isolated mythological references. They're consistent accounts from different cultures, describing the same phenomenon. Advanced beings providing knowledge and guidance to early human civilizations, then maintaining influence through hereditary priestly classes trained in special knowledge and practices. What fascinates me most is how this information has been preserved in plain sight for thousands of years, but interpreted as mythology rather than historical record. It's as if the real story of human development has been hiding behind symbolic language that we've been trained not to take literally. I've started looking at other archaeological mysteries through this lens, and the patterns are extraordinary. Why do ancient sites around the world demonstrate similar construction techniques, despite being separated by thousands of miles and centuries? Why do unrelated cultures share nearly identical creation myths and descriptions of gods who provided civilizing knowledge? The conventional explanation is that these similarities result from universal human psychological patterns, that all cultures naturally develop similar mythological themes. But what if the similarities exist because they're describing the same historical events from different cultural perspectives? If you're still reading this, I want you to consider something. The next time you visit a museum with ancient artifacts, look carefully at the engineering precision of objects that were supposedly created by primitive civilizations. Notice how many ancient sites are oriented toward astronomical phenomena that require sophisticated knowledge to calculate. Pay attention to the mathematical and scientific knowledge embedded in ancient texts and monuments. Ask yourself whether the explanations you've been given for these achievements really make sense, or whether they're just the most comfortable interpretations for a worldview that assumes human civilization developed in isolation. The documents I studied have been taken away, but the implications of what they revealed continue to shape how I understand the world around us. We live in a time when humanity is finally developing the technological capability to detect and communicate with non-human intelligences. Maybe it's time we acknowledge that such communication has been happening all along, and that some of the most important knowledge guiding human development has never been entirely human in origin. What do you think about this discovery? Have you ever noticed patterns in ancient history that don't quite fit the conventional explanations? More importantly, if evidence emerged proving that human civilization has been guided by non-human intelligence, how would that change your understanding of who we are and what we're capable of becoming? I'm curious to hear about your own observations and experiences. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from people outside academic institutions who are willing to look at evidence without the biases that formal education can create. And if you work in archaeology, history, or related fields, I'd love to know whether you've encountered similar evidence that challenges conventional narratives. There may be more of us out there than the academic establishment wants to acknowledge, and it's time we started comparing notes. The truth about our origins and development is too important to be hidden away in private collections or dismissed by institutions more interested in preserving their authority than advancing human knowledge. Whatever the risks of acknowledging what we might really be, they're probably smaller than the risks of continuing to operate with incomplete information about our place in the cosmos.